It looks like we've got a good attendance so far, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Telling Your Story to the Media, a conversation with elder abuse expert Shawna Reeves and journalist Nick Leiber. This webinar is being hosted by the California Elder Justice Coalition and the Institute on Aging and is part of California Elder Justice Coalition's National Advocates Academy webinar series. We would like to thank several organizations that partnered with us for this webinar: the National Center on Elder Abuse, Next Avenue, Legal Aid Association of California, and Legal Assistance for Seniors. Before we begin, I'll just review a few logistical points. There is a closed captioning available for this webinar, which I will be turning on in a moment. You should see an option to select closed captioning on your screen if you'd like to enable that function. Also, since there will be discussion between the speakers today, you may want to view the webinar in gallery view as opposed to speaker view. Depending on what type of device you're using today, there should be an option to change the view by clicking on More in the participant menu on your screen or on View in the upper right corner. If you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A feature on your screen to type in a question at any time. We have time set aside at the end of the webinar to answer questions. If you experience any technical issues, please use the chat feature to let us know. A recording of the webinar will be posted on the CEJC website in case you need to leave early, or if you'd like to share it with your colleagues. For those of you who requested continuing education units when you registered for the webinar, you'll receive an evaluation survey from the Institute on Aging, which will need to be completed. Continuing education certificates will be sent out within 14 working days after the webinar today. Our panelists today are Shawna Reeves, the Director of the Elder Abuse Prevention at Institute on Aging, and Nick Leiber, a contributor at Bloomberg Business Week and Bloomberg News. Also, CEJC's Executive Director, Lisa Narenberg, will be joining us for the Q&A portion of the webinar today. With that, I will now turn it over to Shawna to get us started today.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you everyone for being here. This webinar today. I have here that I was going to thank everyone, but Christine just did it, so thanks. I'm really happy to be here with Nick. We are really excited to talk to you today about how to get your story out to media. The way we're going to do it today, we're going to do little intros of ourselves, kind of our interests in doing this. And then I'm going to ask Nick some questions. Kind of all the questions I've always wanted to ask a journalist. And then as Christine said, we're going to open it up to your questions. I also want to let you know about the handout that we've created for today. But first I'll just get started by saying I've really wanted to do this webinar for a while. It's one of my particular interests, working in the field for over 15 years. I think it's incredibly important that doing it. As I kind of fell into it back in 2006 I was working on a project that was helping elder victims of predatory lending in the South Bay of California, San Jose primarily. And we started getting phone calls because the housing market was crashing. Not immediately, not when we started the project, but shortly thereafter. And so I remember getting a call at my desk from a real estate business reporter that I really respected. And she asked me a question that kind of blew my mind, because it was like the question we were having too, but in my head, I thought, I'm sure other people know the answer. I'm sure reporters know the answer, maybe a business professor. But her question was, what's the difference between a subprime loan and a predatory loan? Now I think we can all kind of, I mean, not all of us, but there's more of an answer to that question now, but back in 2007, it was a little bit different. And I didn't have a great answer for her. That was actually an answer that was, if I gave it, it was potentially a trap. And so I at that point said, you know, here are my thoughts on it, but I can't exactly give you the definition of each, but let me just tell you, I'm a big fan and I subscribe to the Mercury News. And actually she told me, that's amazing. Like, people don't really subscribe to the newspaper if they're not a senior citizen. And that's not to be ageist, that's just to tell you kind of the reality of news, both today and 2007. And Nick's going to tell you a little bit more about that. But from that phone call, I remember thinking, okay, so I could have easily said, nah, I'm not talking to media, not interested. But at that point, I realized, like, we were the only game in town helping elders with that particular issue. We might not have known all the answers, but we were in it. And they were coming to us with questions and wanting to collaborate and possibly do future stories, but that really wasn't what it was about. It was more about working with them and being a resource. So that was really eye-opening for me. At that point, I was a social worker. I was also coordinating the project. So I went to the person I was supposed to talk to about, you know, how to talk to media. And at that point, I got some, what I would consider pretty bad advice. I'm just being totally honest here. She told me, it's your job to get that journalist to write your story. You want to make sure she definitely quotes you. She talks about your program and you need to control the story. And again, this came from a woman who just called to ask me a basic question. I was not in a position to pitch or anything. We didn't even have clients who were ready to talk to the media. So the information I was getting from this person was not helpful. If you're going to write a story, you generally want at least, you know, a client or two to highlight. And so I trusted myself, which was good. I didn't like call the reporter back and say, hey, this is what you need to write about. Here's my program. I'm not going to answer your question. You're going to write about my program. But it also piqued my interest even more about how to do this. And then at that point, I got a little bit more about being proactive instead of just responsive. And again, these are super important skills to learn because it's through media that we get attention to the issues we care about. It's through talking to media that we can check power, because often it's really the regulations, as a lot of us know who work in elder abuse prevention and response, you know, there isn't a lot of recourse, and there aren't a lot of checking of a lot of these groups that are committing the elder abuse. So if you get a well-placed article, a well-researched article that people read, it can actually be a check against power, and it can lead to policy change. I'm also interested in kind of relocating the power in the client stories. I would have clients come to me when I was working that job helping elders who were stuck in these predatory subprime mortgages, who would say, I want to talk to the media. Or someone say, I want to talk to the government. And they would be very much wanting to do that sort of self-advocacy. And I saw it as core to my job that I would help connect those elders to get their stories out and to get this ball rolling. So becoming proactive, that was quite fun, actually. I know it's hard to say fun and elder abuse prevention in the same sentence, but when you feel like you're really having impact, it actually can be fun. So I started kind of tracking the reporters that were doing like really great work in the elder justice arena. Not those who necessarily put elder abuse in their articles, but maybe someone who wrote a really great story about reverse mortgage advertisements and how deceptive and abusive they can be, or annuity scams. And I would keep track of them. And then if I did come across something or someone, a client who wanted to tell their story, I would keep that reporter in mind. And I would say, hey, I saw your super great article about reverse mortgage advertising abuse. Here's another issue, kind of similar, not the same thing, but you did such a great job with that. Would you be interested in this? And it actually worked. And I was shocked because I thought, okay, I'm going to make all these phone calls, not going to get anywhere. I used to say there's a 5% chance of this reporter actually wanting to do the story, but the success rate was actually much higher. And I think it helps when you show them that you're actually paying attention to what they're writing and you feel that what you have to offer might be a good fit for them. So the purpose of this webinar is to demystify this process. It's to empower you so that you're not freaked out. You don't just say, no, why would I do that? I'm not even going to attempt it. It's to give you a little bit of insight into how it works and then to empower you to feel comfortable. I know because I looked at the people who signed up for this webinar that we have people from all different sorts of professions from within the elder justice field. We have lawyers, social workers, we even have some public relations people, advocates, public guardians. Some of my friends and family are on this webinar. We have people from all corners. And so we want to make sure that this is relevant to you. And instead of just having me tell you, what's worked for me in the last 10 to 15 years, we have a real journalist to tell you how it works. And that's what's so exciting about this, I think. You don't just have a fan of journalism telling you something, but you have an actual journalist. So why Nick? Why did I ask Nick? Well, Nick has written 2 in-depth, incredible articles about elder financial abuse for Bloomberg News. I remember reading the first one and thinking, who is this guy? This is incredible. This is the article we've been wanting. Like, at the vet, the number of people he interviewed, the actual people he contacted and got interviews with was fantastic. And then he wrote another one that was more about financial abuse committed by big business. Again, like the article that we've really wanted to see for a really long time. So that's why I think it's so wonderful to have Nick Leiber with us here today. Again, why is this important? I give a lot of presentations on elder abuse. I do it for a living. It's my job. I'm an advocate. I give presentations. But when you ask elders how they want to find out about elder abuse, like scams, what to watch out for, kind of what's going on, they don't want to go to seminars. Dr. Marty DeLiama, who's actually featured in one of Nick's articles, presented at the Tamkin Elder Justice Symposium at USC about 2 years ago about where elders want to get their news on these topics. And it was cable news, radio, and print media. And I don't mean to misstate her research because I was looking for it last night and couldn't find it, but elder abuse workshops were not on the list. When I got to the field, there was a lot of talk about how to get elders to come to these presentations because no one wants to come to a presentation called elder abuse. So how can we creatively give them other names so that they'll want to come? And I'm just not about that. I would be really mad if I showed up to something that I thought was about something else, elder health or something like that, and it was actually about elder abuse. So we want to empower, and we want to show people, we want to give people what they want in the mediums where they want to get it. And that's largely news media. It's not to disparage what you all are doing out there and the incredible advocacy work you're doing. Workshops are important, but you can maybe get 50 elders at a workshop, but you can get 50,000 to read one of Nick's articles, probably more. So it's really important work. I also just wanted to leave you with this thought in my intro that you don't have to be perfect. I will share that a few years ago, I was asked by a news outlet to comment on an elder abuse verdict against the insurance giant MetLife. And I was happy to do it. I gave my quote, a couple, and then I read the final article, and I had called MetLife a multi-million-dollar company. At that point, you know that it's a social worker giving that comment. No business person would call MetLife a multi-million-dollar company. It's clearly a multi-billion-dollar company. But in the end, it's not about perfection. It's about going with your heart, doing what's right. If you're confident in what you say should get out there, you should say it. If it's above your head and you don't want to say it, you shouldn't say it. But it's not about being perfect. And it's about doing the advocacy work that we want to do so we can make the world a better place for elders. That's my intro. And I also wanted to just tell you a little bit about the resources that we put together for you before we get to Nick. That's what we're all really wanting to hear from. So Christine is going to screen share here. Nick and I put these resources together for you. We might not get to all of these topics today, but these are great resources for you for later. The first is journalism jargon, when you're wanting to know what the difference is between on the record, off the record, on background, on deep background. Even I get confused. Oxford University Press put a little fact sheet together so you can tell what's going on. Yeah, because we've all heard about like the Judith Miller case and we don't want to go there. So look at the journalism jargon before you talk to a reporter. And then we want to give you some information on the state of the news media today. And Nick's going to tell you a little bit about kind of like the dwindling number of reporters, the rise in number of other professions, And so there's a little bit of statistics there for you. Also an article written by a reporter who's suffered a lot of trauma reporting on COVID and is not alone in that regard. There does appear to be what is considered an epidemic within a pandemic of reporters really suffering as they report on these issues. And then some kind of troubling behaviors by reporters doing casting calls, calling nonprofits, asking for very specific types of clients that they can feature in their articles. And maybe Nick can tell you a little bit about that. There are best practices and poor practices for journalists as well. Then I included something here about considerations when, if, say you want to talk to a reporter. There's been some really incredible reporting on nursing home abuses, and it's been from largely people working within nursing homes who are not allowed to speak on record about what they're seeing. Same with hospitals. So you probably do want to seek out legal advice. I'm talking to lawyers all the time, but I'm very lucky because I know them because of the work I do. But some speech is protected. And so you want to check out what the National Labor Relations Board considers kind of bound by maybe your company's media policy and maybe not. So you are allowed to talk about things that are in the public interest or workplace issues. And so I put an article here written by attorneys that actually represent HR departments. And so it's not something that they're actually writing that they're kind of horrified that employees have the right to speak about so many things, reporters. I think it's a unique perspective, but a good one. And then because we are hearing so much about the devastation facing elders during the pandemic, I wanted to put in a couple articles about uplifting stories. One of the things I've heard from advocates is, I hope this keeps up. I hope we're not just hearing about nursing home devastation 2 years from now, but we're also hearing stories of hope, especially within communities of color. So we're seeing tons of trauma reporting, as you might want to call it, about these communities that have been so affected by pandemic. But there's also a lot of beauty in these communities, and we want to make sure that we uplift those too and feature those and make sure journalists know about those beautiful stories. And on the right side, all the elder abuse stories that, not all of them, this is just a fraction, but the ones that I think really touched Nick and I this year. And then there's one from a few years ago about abuse within the guardianship system that I'm sure a number of you know about. And then I put next to outstanding Bloomberg articles about elder financial abuse in there. So that'll be your handout. I might tinker with it a little bit if we bring up other points and articles, but that's what you'll be getting afterwards from what I know right now. And so now I want to hand it over to Nick Leiber. I've told you about him a little bit, but I'll let him tell you about himself.
Thank you, Shawna. Thank you so much. It's really an honor, a privilege to be here. I want to thank Lisa, your teams for inviting me to share my perspective. I've been a journalist for 20 plus years, really interested in stories that are about the intersection of business and society, stories that increase public awareness of problems and solutions. I first became aware of the elder abuse epidemic in 2018, when I visited a long-term care facility in the Bronx. The director of that facility and of the nonprofit River Spring Living, Dan Reingold, he sort of opened my eyes to the physical, the mental, and the financial elder abuse that was happening across the country at epidemic levels. And he's someone who helped launch the first elder abuse shelter in the US. So it's an area that I think about, that I'm working on. I have a caveat that I'd like to just share with you, that I'm sharing my perspectives in the hope that they might help you decide whether to approach the media. But these are just my opinions. I don't speak for anyone or any organization. I speak for myself as an independent journalist with experience writing, producing TV, podcasting, and I probably have a different approach as a national contributor than would a local reporter or a radio person or a TV person. So I'm coming to it really as someone writing for online, for print, and these are my thoughts. So let's see. I think, given time, I think, you should just fire away, Shawna, at questions that you have for me, and I'll do my best to answer
my
them.
dream.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Well, first, thank you, Nick, again. And I always love the opportunity to play Donahue. I'm very excited. If you could tell us a little bit about the process involved in writing a story. I think the public thinks they're pitching you a story, but they don't understand that you're actually also pitching your editor a story. So if you could just tell us what's involved in that.
Sure.
Sure.
Well, I think when I work, I need to, of course, to explain the story to an editor. I have to explain it. And a question that any editor will likely ask is, what's new here? Mm-hmm. And why would a reader want to read this now? Why should they be reading it now? So I need to figure those questions out. I need to find examples of people who are willing to talk, examples of people who have been through things, family members who can talk about it, experts. I need to find data, numbers. I kind of need those ingredients to feel like, okay, I can move forward on saying to an editor, I think there's a story here, and I think I know how we can do this story. It's a collaboration with an editor. It's about trust, and it's about really making the reader see what I see and what other people see. Like, I can't hold their head and show them the page and talk to them as they're reading it. So I have to make it just as clear as possible. So those ingredients help me do that, because there are real people involved. There are numbers. There are people who've spent a lot of time, who have these unique vantage points, like you, for example, like Lisa, who can say, this is something that I'm seeing, that we're seeing. And we're not just seeing it in Austin, Texas. We're also seeing it in Oakland, California. And we're also seeing it in Detroit, et cetera, et cetera. So those are sort of what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about putting a story together.
Okay, great. Other question. So I pay attention to beats, I guess is what you call them. So you'll notice a journalist will write like 8 stories about elder abuse, and you're like, okay, that person's going for an award. But it's also a great sign that if you give them some information that fits with what they've already been reporting on or is within that theme, then there's a better chance that they'll be able to write it. Your beat right now, it seems, is like businesses in COVID. Like you've been writing these wonderful stories about like Main Street, I guess you'd say, and COVID. But you're also writing elder abuse stories. How do we know like what your beat is or what another reporter's beat is without obsessively reading everything, which is what I do? Is there a way to get that information? Or say, if someone came to you, this is a two-parter, if someone came to you with a great story, but it just doesn't fit with what you're working on right now, would you refer it to another reporter, or would you recommend? I guess just how do we get at the right reporter information?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a hard question, because I'm a weird beast, because I do different things as an independent journalist, as opposed to a staff reporter somewhere who covers, say, Apple or covers housing. So I'm not a great example, but I think if you know what where do you find your news? Where do you find your information? You have your local paper, hopefully. You listen to the radio, you watch TV. You think about who have I read, who have I listened to, who have I watched, who I think does a good job. Does it cover a story that does this person or these people cover a story I want to tell? And then I would Google them. I would see what they do. But I don't have like a magic guide to it. If I get an idea that I don't have time to do, or that I don't know is out of my normal kind of stories that I do, then if I think it's a strong story, then I would call someone up who I know, or email it to them, in my own little network of people, acquaintances, people who do this. But there's no magic, like I don't have a perfect way to do it. It's kind of it can be a time consuming process.
Okay. And that's good to know. And yeah, I'm not asking for a prescriptive kind of, this is the magic sauce, but I think it is good to, actually, it's good to know that it also can take a while, I think, to find the right person.
Right.
Yeah, and to not feel rejected, like, oh, my story it's not meaningful or useful to anyone because this one reporter didn't want it. It might just be that it's not the right fit.
Or timing too. I mean,
it
can be that the person who you pitched is busy with 6 things or 2 things, or they're doing, their kids are home from school because of COVID and they're, homeschooling. It can mean many things. So I wouldn't be disappointed by it.
Right.
And I certainly think there are people. I mean, it kind of makes me think about some numbers that I was looking at that I pulled from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, just about journalism, the industry as a whole. I was just trying to say, well, how many journalists are there today? And how many lawyers are there? And how many public relations professionals are there? And how many social workers are there? So I went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it looks like in 2019, there were 52,000 journalists. There were 274,000 public relations professionals. There were 813,000 lawyers. There were 713,000 social workers. All of those industries, I think, were expected to grow. The BLS says, okay, in 2019, this is what we estimate the numbers to be. In 2029, this is what we estimate the numbers to be. In terms of all those industries, journalism is expected to shrink by 11% by 2029. So another thing that's going on as you think about pitching and who you read, who you listen to, who you watch, there are fewer people than there used to be. So people are trying to do a lot, and there are relatively limited resources, which then makes me think, well, then how do you get their attention? And I think you read the reporter's writing or listen to their work or watch their work, and then you reach out and you be yourself. I mean, you can say, this is my first time reaching out. I have this story that I'd like to be told, but I'm not sure I actually want to do it. I want to understand your process. Be honest, but know that you might be wasting your own time. Know that you might spend an hour on the phone with this person and they might not do a story, or they might include just a quote from you. That's sort of putting that sort of industry in context, and then like how I would think about crafting a pitch. I guess that's how I would think about it.
Okay. Yeah, because the next I was going to ask you about crafting a pitch. So thank you. Anything else about that? We've talked about this trust issue. I was telling you how I feel really lucky and fortunate to be comfortable talking with journalists now, but it wasn't that way in the beginning. And it's not always comfortable and easy, but if you know the person and you trust them and you've already worked with them, it really, really helps. How would you suggest going about developing that trust? You said when you tell them, if you're calling a journalist, you can say, I have this thing, how does your process work? For some people, that might even be difficult because it's a little bit intimidating to call a journalist, first of all, and then say, hey, what's your deal before we get started. But I do think it's important. I think it's important to set those boundaries, the parameters, and set expectations. And it probably helps you as well, I'm thinking.
Yeah, well, I might start with writing an email.
Okay.
And,
an email.
And say, I've been reading your work, and what this something has happened to me or to a loved one, and I would like public awareness about it. I would like people to know that this happened. I've read your work, I've listened to your work, and I think you're the person who maybe would want to help me tell the story. This is what it is in a nutshell, in a paragraph.
Great. Okay.
Can we talk? And can we talk, in a way that you tell me how your process works? Because I don't know that I'm ready to actually do it, to take the plunge and to have my name or my loved one's name be out there in print forever. That's a way to think about it. I think, reading about or researching the journalist can be helpful, researching their work like you already talked about. But there's no magic. There's no perfect way to do it beyond, really, I think thinking about what you want as someone saying, hey, I want a story. Why do you want the story? Do you want to increase public awareness?
Right.
Do you want something else to happen? Do you want to tell the world how great you are? Do you want to tell the world how not great someone else is? Like, what do you want? I think is something to think through first. I think that is helpful.
Great. Yeah, the wanting, what do you want piece, I think, is so critical, and it often will extend to the clients, right? So one of the early dilemmas I had working with elders who were being foreclosed on, rendered homeless due to really terrible loans, was, does this elder want to then like kind of be brought through the mud again in the form of media exposure? So it really was critical to understand what the client's motivation was, and if they truly understood the risks and benefits of going forward. And I didn't feel that it was my place to try and talk a client out of speaking to media. I was working at a nonprofit at the time that really supported this endeavor and was not overly paternalistic when it came to clients. But say if there was crossover, if this client was also open to adult protective services, wonderful, wonderful service, adult protective services, but they had a whole different view on the media, at least where I was working, where it was just, what, no, you don't get involved in that. I mean, a lot of adult protective services clients do have cognitive issues, dementia. They can't even consent at that point. But for the elders that were fully in charge of their faculties, wanted to empower themselves by talking to media, wanted to have what happened to them not happen to others. It was not my job to get in their way and tell them no. I thought it was my job to help them access that, access to reporters and sometimes access to government officials and sometimes both. Because as you know, Nick, like often there'll be a big story and then the next day some politician will say, and we're having a hearing about that. And because of this story, really kind of wonderful outcomes. Right. The other side of that is elders who you have a relationship with because you're their social worker and you don't want them to feel that they're being pressured into getting media on their case because you're also providing them services. So I was like a social worker helping connect them to like meals assistance programs or housing resources. And I never wanted them to think that if you don't want this to talk to this reporter, then somehow I was going to take services away from them or that our relationship would change. So my preference is always for the client to be the one initiating. I very rarely be like, hey, you want media on this? Unless, yeah, it really needs to be client driven. I also prefer the elder to be represented, but I also know that legal aid is also suffering in this country. So not all elders have access to attorneys or that they have the support of a really powerful community group. In California, we have the California Reinvestment Coalition. It's an organization of, I don't know if it's 100, but it's many, many community orgs, and they will really throw their support and firepower behind people who are fighting those folks when they want to talk to media. If it's a social worker and you're working for a social services org and you don't have the support of your larger org and it's just you and the client, I would say really to get more support if you can. This is just me thinking this through. I don't know if that makes sense, but now I really prefer to have the client also represented by an attorney, because attorneys, for an attorney who is also open to letting the client talk to media, because sometimes they can also help the elder with that support when talking to reporters. But Nick, what's your thought on that? Because I know attorneys can also really be not helpful, or not helpful, but really not about talking to media. But also I think when an elder is represented, it can also help. It can help get you access to documents you need. It can get you help to like other information. But what are your thoughts on that? Like having someone completely alone, someone like an elder, a vulnerable elder, or not a really empowered elder, or an elder with a social worker, elder with a lawyer, or elder with a community org behind them? You have thoughts on that?
I mean, when you know, everyone's story is unique, everyone's situation is unique. I think you want to do your best to be as forthcoming and transparent as possible. I think you want to be helpful. I think you want to let the person speak for themselves if you feel, they can. And I think each situation is different. I don't think, again, sorry, I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think it circles back to the trust. Do you trust this outlet, this reporters? Is your goal public awareness? Well, if your goal is public awareness and you want people to read a story and for it to resonate with them, and for it to be compelling, you do need people to talk, and you do need them to explain what happened to them. In the same breath, you don't want to re-victimize people, and you don't want to, have someone tell their story if they don't want to tell their story. I think it's a decision that each person has to make. And I've talked to people and said, think this through, and that's, I think that's really the difficult answer, and the reality for each person is it's just a unique situation.
Right.
So,
yeah. And I think it's good you're saying it's complex, because it is. And I think in the vast majority of cases, the clients I've worked with have been really glad that they talked to media and went through with it, and didn't regret it at all. But I think it is good to talk it through, and you talk it through with people who call you, but I think also as advocates, social workers, lawyers, what have you, it's also good that we have those conversations as well, and provide support where we can.
right.
And just know that there isn't one right way necessarily.
Right.
Great. So we're talking about sources, and you hit upon this a little bit, but you said are you saying you prefer email from sources?
Yeah, I think
Like to be
well, I've just been getting all these spam calls. So I have this automated thing on my phone now where it just goes right. It is labeled spam, or it goes into voicemail. But I think initially, like I want to vet people. So if I get an email and I know can find who the person is, with their name and where they are, that's helpful. Understand their story, and then decide, do I have time to do this? Can I do it justice? Do I understand it? Is it something I can be helpful with? Again, because I'm in this, I'm trying to write national stories. If you have a story that is really a local story, then it's probably, it may be part of a larger story. Would you be comfortable with that? Thinking that through. So it's helpful. It's helpful to get an email, so I can take a look and think it through that way, because I don't want to waste.
Right. And for people with sensitive information, so I talked about people working in nursing homes, the very brave people that really, tried the best they could to blow the whistle internally, sometimes externally, but in the end, they just felt ethically obligated. They had to talk to press. Do you think a quick paragraph email, like you said before, very kind of broad, makes sense? Or at that point, should they be moving towards a more encrypted format, say Signal, something like that? Or just does email work? And then you can decide how to further protect your source down the road if you need to.
Yeah, I think I would look at what the reporter makes available on their Twitter handle, for example, or on their author page. And some people will put other ways of getting in touch with them beyond email. And if that's what they're suggesting you do, then try that.
Okay. Great.
But I think an initial email, a paragraph is a way to start. I don't think you need to be super specific if it's super sensitive or you're worried for whatever reason about different things. You can, I think you could probably word it in a way that'll be understood by a savvy reporter what you're getting at or what you hope to get at. I think that's fair.
Great. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. So we talked a little bit about how to safeguard people themselves, their jobs, their clients. Do you have any further tips on that? I mean, I think in the ideal situation, you're not going to be going off record. I know journalists definitely prefer on record, and you won't have to go through all that, but there are these situations, and I've seen them a lot more, it appears, during the pandemic, and outlets being more comfortable with, or by necessity feeling that they need to print information from anonymous sources. For folks that are really afraid, they're afraid of losing their jobs, they're afraid of like professional humiliation. What are your tips for folks in that situation?
I mean, again, I think it's finding someone who seems, a journalist who seems like you could trust them.
Okay.
I think it's talking it through, thinking it through, identifying again your goal, identifying what, I guess it's pretty clear if you're worried about losing your job or you're worried about professional humiliation, that's pretty clear what your fear is, and perhaps articulating that from the get-go. I would like you to write a story about information I'd like to share with you, but I'm worried about getting fired, or I'm worried about being humiliated. I would like to do this anonymously, and asking that question. And that's often not a call that the reporter themselves can make, but rather is a decision that will have to be made with the reporter's editors. And that's something that happens, and that in some cases it makes sense. In other cases it doesn't, so that's just having that, expressing that, I think, and then seeing what happens. But you're taking a risk. You are taking a risk, and that's you kind of know that. But you can take a calculated risk. You can do your research.
So make sure you know who you're working with.
Yeah, I think so, and the publication. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You and I have talked a little bit about kind of red flags, yellow flags. Also on the handout, there's a whole article about it. But I told you about an email I got. This has happened a few times, but this one happened more recently. An email to my Gmail, which was weird. So like someone had to find my Gmail online, from a major publication. I won't say which one. I think it was a stringer, but still, it's from like a major publication. And he said, here's a scenario. I want your comment on it by Friday. And I was like, hello? Like, I don't even know who you are. And I don't know if this scenario is like an actual case or if you just made it up. And why do you think I am obligated to answer you by Friday? And in that situation, I just ignored it. But that I would say is probably a bad way to try and get comments from people working in nonprofits. In the article listed on the handout, they talk about these reporters that will do casting calls, basically call a nonprofit, say they're looking for a very specific type of victim, to write a very specific type of story with a certain angle, and how it can really turn off a nonprofit. I don't really get too many of those anymore, which is nice. But yeah, like predatory lending. So we want someone who's 95 and about to get locked out by the sheriff, and won't mind us taking pictures, that sort of casting call situation. So those are, you're talking about all the like good things you're looking for in a reporter when you reach out. Are there any other things that you would say just kind of watch out for? I know we talked about like researching a publication. There are some publications that are much less that have much less of a track record at protecting their sources or actually being helpful to people. But do you have any other suggestions like that, or suggestions about that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you read or watch or listen to something that you really don't like, don't volunteer to talk, to be a source for them. I think your warning signs, your antenna will go up if someone is saying, hey, do this for me right away, and doesn't sort of appreciate that you've got other things going on in your job, in your work. I mean, I think, but again, there's no one size fits all. But if someone is rude, or someone
Yeah.
doesn't really, doesn't take the time to realize what you do, what you're doing, it can be a warning sign. Other times, people are really busy and they don't mean to be rude, and they don't,
Yeah.
and they're on deadline and they're trying to. So there's also that. I mean, I think it's give and take, but there's no perfect. I think there are plenty of examples of times that journalists don't do a good job. And there's also plenty of examples of when they do try to do a good job. And with complex stories, it can be really hard to be perfect.
Yeah.
But I think I think in reading, watching, listening, you can find people who are trying their best. And I think you can sort of identify it. I mean, another thing to keep in mind is when people are doing things, they're not really, quote unquote, doing them for you, doing them really to tell the story or a bigger story, even though it's your story. So you might not always agree with how it's presented, which again goes back to that trust and researching component that you would want to do first. And before you decide. And I think it's fair to say during an interview, I'm not comfortable talking about that. I think that's completely fair to say. I can talk about this and this, but just up front, I don't want to talk about the circumstances of X, Y, Z. I think it's now that may mean that you don't end up in the story, but I think that's completely fair. Kind of more at ease,
And I've always been amazed by that. People like, I didn't end up in the story, and I'm always like, I mean, it's like icing, I guess, if I get quoted, but also I like doing behind the scenes stuff, and so it's always kind of shocking to me. It's like not about promoting your brand. I hate that word, but it's like about the actual story. Like, sure, you talked about your program for half an hour, but like the story didn't really jive with what you do in the program. So of course it didn't make it into the article, and that's fine. The whole purpose of the article is not to make you shine or your program shine. And sometimes the reporter just has to go in a different direction, and that's fine. In partnership with the editor. Yeah.
Right. There's that relationship too, where they're trying to say, well, what's new here and why are we telling it now? Right. Going back to that idea that we talked about at the beginning of our chat. And if it's hard to do that, then it's going to be hard to have the article or the segment be published.
Yeah. Right. And I think one of my absolute favorite things is when a reporter calls, sometimes a year later, 2 years later, and they say, now's the time. Like, oh, amazing. Which brings me to my next kind of final topic in our deliverables section of this webinar, what you're supposed to learn this order. How do you develop and maintain those relationships with reporters? Early on, I did what I called adopt a reporter, maybe many, where I read a lot anyway. So I would just always read their stuff. If it really me is wonderful, I would reach out and just say, this means a lot. This means a lot to us. This means a lot to the people who are suffering the indignity that you wrote about. Like it really helps a lot to see this in getting attention of media, and then knowing that people are learning about this issue. Just to show that appreciation. And often I'll get a response like, wow, like they say they don't hear that often from advocates about the meaning of their stories or how much it's touched them. And I don't know, maybe I figured a lot of people are writing to reporters thanking them, but it turns out they're not. So I think it's really important that if you see something, you tell them. And then if you see something that looks like another issue that they might want to cover, you can say, you did such a great job with that. You want to look at this, if not, no big deal. But that's my personal way of keeping relationships. But do you have other suggestions, or maybe
obviously I love writing, reading. So when someone who is, in this has this great vantage point, and this is what they do, and they write a note or a letter like that, I mean, it means a lot, of course. I think that is the perfect way to express your thanks. I can't think of a better way, honestly. I mean, it means a lot. It really does. And it can be a sentence. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Same with, if you don't agree with something, say it. That's, but, I think people are, particularly, here we are in this pandemic, or coming out of this pandemic, at least in the US, people are, I try to give people the benefit of the doubt. People are trying their best, so generally, so a note like that can really be very, very meaningful to a reporter.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And then something else I've noticed is that reporters seem to be very grateful if you can't answer a question, or like, I have opinions about a lot of things, but I'm not an expert, that you give them other people to talk to.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Great. Again, I'm shocked like how grateful they are, because it's like, well, it's just people I know. I'm just gonna
yeah.
But it seems like they appreciate it.
And also saying, saving people your time, their time, saying to, I don't know, this is not my subject matter expertise, but if you talk to this person, she really works on this and she might want to talk to you.
Right.
And here's her phone number, here's her email, and you can say that I sent you. That can mean a lot.
Okay.
That can mean a lot within government agencies, within other entities, people, it's, yes, absolutely. It's very, very helpful.
Okay, great. And then I think I wanted to close this portion by just asking you, and as a journalist, how this might be really personal, but how you're doing. Because I read that article about journalists reporting for 14 months straight on COVID. Right now, COVID, businesses and COVID is your beat.
Yeah.
How are you doing
as
a working journalist right now?
I'm doing well. I thankfully, live with a psychologist, which is very helpful. But no, that article is not my situation. That article is just something that in the course of, it popped up and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. That's really about, covering some of the awful illness and the effects and the deaths, and working, I have not experienced what is being explained in that article. So I'm good. I'm
good.
Grateful, happy, I'm glad that I get to do this. Again, like I said, I really feel like I'm in this privileged position where people share things with me and trust me to try to do a good job. So I'm doing very well. But I've certainly heard a lot of awful things, as I think many people who are on this call or this webinar, you take in a lot, and you try to make sense of it. And, different stories, some that have nothing to do with this topic, but, you remember things, just like a really powerful story that sort of sticks with you a moment or two. I will remember things, just like you and many in this webinar will remember specific things that people told them in confidence that you'll never probably forget.
Right.
And that's something to sit with, right? That's not good or bad. It's a privilege, right? It's trust.
Right.
And part of what is kind of amazing about being a journalist is you get to dip into all these different lives and hear these stories and try to make sense of them. Explain them again. You can't take the reader and say, this is what I'm seeing, but you can try your best to say this is what I understand this to mean. Amazing.
Yeah. Wow. A gift too.
Yeah.
What struck me about that article too was how she referred to therapists or to journalists as like therapists without the training. But it sounds like the fact that you have a therapist helps you. So that's good. Or even, I don't know how I would deal with trolls or even comments, but Annapurna Montefiore from New York Times doing fantastic reporting on COVID. I feel like she filed like 48 stories in the course of a year, maybe less. I read that somewhere, and to know that she was getting threats because she had written about the risk of COVID spread in schools, and so then people were blaming her for schools staying closed. Or she's probably getting it from the other end too, maybe not being reporting. Maybe her reporting seemed too strict or too cautious. Who knows? But just the constant feedback that you get, like as a journalist, probably some of it welcome, but a lot of it unwelcome, especially if you're working for a national news organization. But it sounds like you roll with it pretty well.
Or local.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, there can be a lot of animosity. We're in this time in our country when things are people get pretty bent out of shape and make threats and use ugly language and don't treat people with respect. It's an unpleasant, probably, and it's also probably, if you're trying to make a point to someone, like I disagree with your article about schools,
right?
Saying awful things about them is certainly not going to make them listen to you,
right?
Unless you're supporting these assertions with facts. You're talking over each other. It's just not. It's not productive. It's not a good. It's not a good use of anyone's time.
Right.
But if someone shows you who they are, I mean.
Right. And we talked about how we're giving our email out to everyone today, but as a reporter, you were telling me last time we spoke, you get lots of emails. So it's not necessarily that you don't care if you're not able to return email, but you might be focusing on a story, or your priorities are just elsewhere for the moment, which we all have that as an issue.
Right. Exactly. Yes, I just don't have a great way of managing dozens or hundreds of emails, and I get a lot of emails. And
as a reporter, you don't have an executive assistant? We talked about the dwindling numbers of reporters. We didn't talk about the funding for reporters either.
Well, that's a whole nother. But
yeah.
I think the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I think they speak for themselves.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Well,
Go on.
So I'm so appreciative, and I can't even imagine all that you must juggle, and you still put out such amazing work. So just wanted to say that, and also thank you for letting me be Donahue and ask you these questions that I've always wanted to ask a reporter. Anything else you wanted to say before we turn it over to Lisa and she tells us what the audience has to say and wants to ask?
No, I'm just very appreciative of you, Shawna, and these great questions and this opportunity to talk about something that's can be mysterious, and I want it to be less mysterious. But again, the caveat of my process is going to be different from other people's process, and this is my take. But if you have an important story that you want to tell, I encourage you to try to tell it. But I don't promise that it will happen, perfectly, magically, very, overnight.
Right.
But hopefully this is helpful to people. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Well, great, Nick. And I was supposed to tell everyone that questions were supposed to be put in the Q&A, and I'm noticing that there has been some chat. Questions have been asked, but also some Q&A. So at this point, I'm not that great at this part of it. I think we're going to have Lisa ask some questions from the audience, because you all have a lot of great questions, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to them. But we will get to those that we can get to. Hi, Lisa.
And hi, everyone. And let me start by really thanking both Nick and Shawna for this really terrific discussion. It's such a rare and valuable opportunity to hear people, talk from the heart and at this level of depth. It really is terrific. Thank you so much. I also just want to say, I think one of the things that we've learned from COVID, we've learned so many things. And one is really how important the media has been in revealing and exposing what's happening. And so I think we really do owe a debt of gratitude to the media, and that's true all the time, but I think even more so during this time when information was so hard to come by. I think also there's been a lot of discussion recently about guardianship, and just about every discussion starts out with the expose that came out of the LA Times many years ago. The media has really played an important part in elder abuse prevention right from the beginning. And so this is such an important topic, and it's really great to be able to talk about it today. We're getting a lot of questions where people are describing their own situations with the system, things that have gone wrong for them, individual personal stories. I would imagine, Nick, that these are the kind of emails that you get a lot from people, describing a personal story, a problem with the system, somebody who reported abuse and then was retaliated against. So I'm going to try to frame this and kind of pull these themes together. What do you see as the role of the media, or is there one, for trying to improve the system's response to these cases when people have different issues? Or when do individual grievances or individual problems become news or public interest issues?
That's a great question. In some cases, I don't know. In other cases, they can become part of a larger story. I think it's rare for a national outlet to do one individual story. I think it's again, you want to hear from people, but you also want to hear from others. You also want data. You also want to know how it might fit into a larger story. That's why it can be so frustrating, because you feel, and you are right to feel this way, this horrible thing is happening or happened, and I want it out in the world. But because it happened and because it's happening doesn't necessarily mean that someone can do a story about it. But if it's part of something we're talking about, you talked about the LA Times story and about it helping to change a system that wasn't working. I haven't read that story, but I imagine there are a number of individual stories within it. So I guess that would be how I answer that question. But it's really difficult to figure that question out, because again, each situation is different.
And Shawna, do you want to respond to that too? Because I know you probably, I know in your work, you're exposed to a lot of other social workers, other practitioners who have these systemic issues. And, when would you see taking it to one of your sources in the media?
Well, for me, it's generally when I have a contact who's so outraged, they feel like they really need to do something about it. So the fire in their belly to say something. One of the things that comes up again and again, though, is, we see these injustices, we see these systemic issues that seem that they're intractable, and it's really going to be hard to get a client to go on record. And 90% of the journalists I speak to want to make sure there's going to be a client lined up. So that becomes like the next thing, the next level. And then we have to go through all the mental calculus, what we talked about before. Is that right? Is there a client who is actually wanting to do that? Is the client able, do they have the capacities to do it? So it's really about getting everything all lined up, stars aligned. Yeah, so
okay.
It really depends.
Great, thank you. This is a question for Nick. What role do newspaper attorneys and editors play with your story? Are you constantly in contact with attorneys? And also reaching elders via email and even by phone has been close. Oh, I guess that's a little bit of a different question. So why don't we start with the first one about attorneys?
But sorry, but the question is, Newspaper attorneys or?
Newspaper attorneys.
I'm generally, or I don't think I've ever been in touch
Okay.
with a newspaper attorney, but I certainly would talk to attorneys who, you know, are representing a client. Certainly I know that many journalists, before stories are published, a legal team at a publication, attorneys will look at a story to make sure that everything makes sense in terms of potential legal repercussions. But I'm not talking to attorneys, you know, in newspapers, no.
Okay. And we have another question. What are your thoughts on advocacy journalism and journalism that focuses on solutions?
I think it's great. I think you can do, you know, I think there are a lot of different forms of journalism. I think it can get tricky to figure out, is this solutions journalism? Is this advocacy journalism? Is this not? But I think people can certainly write stories that advocate. I think people can write stories that don't advocate. I think that you can try to show people solutions. I think that, you know, there are probably a number of different places, new and old, that try to do that. And some do it really well, and some it's harder to do. You know, it's hard to get people to want to read things.
Mm-hmm.
If you're saying this is just the advocate's perspective, it can be harder to make someone want to read it. If you say this is the advocate's perspective and these other perspectives, more people might want to read it. It depends on the reader. It depends on the journalist, the publication. But I think it's certainly something that people can do, and it can be very helpful.
Great.
This might be a good time to talk about the magic of John Oliver, because he's both proposing solutions and also he's in an alternative kind of format where people don't have to read. They just need to watch something really entertaining for 15 minutes. And
Right.
Nick talked about him, and we put the latest John Oliver piece on long-term care in the resources handout. I remember when John Oliver did his piece on predatory payday lending, I was getting all sorts of calls and texts and emails from people I hadn't heard from in a long time, just celebrating that an issue they had worked on for so long had landed with John Oliver. So Nick, did you want to say anything about that? I don't mean to co-opt you, but
Well, I think, you know, I've done some producing for sort of a Spanish version of John Oliver, and I think, you know, those shows like John Oliver, I know they have journalists who work to put together, you know, the facts and the analysis. And John Oliver is an excellent presenter. You want to listen to a subject that, if you weren't part of this world, you might want to not listen to. So I think it's incredibly powerful, effective, great stuff. I mean, I think absolutely, you know, I wish, you know, I knew how to do exactly that, you know, quite, you know, but it's a team of people, you know, doing it, and it can affect how people think about all these difficult, complex problems. So, you know, more power to John Oliver. You know?
And Nick, I wanted to give you an opportunity to plug your podcast. One of my questions is, how did you come up with the name? Don't interrupt me, por favor.
Okay.
And maybe actually just broaden that also. We've talked mostly about print and broadcast media today. There are other avenues like podcasts, like Twitter, like blogs. Are there different approaches to those kinds of media?
Sure. Well, I'll answer your first question first. So the podcast is a bilingual podcast. It's in Spanish and English, no translation. It's really about love of languages and about people who live their lives in multiple languages. And it's an interview format. And we've talked to all sorts of people, some attorneys, some, you know, you sort of name it. And the name came from the director at a radio station who, as we were presenting the idea, one of the hosts talked a lot, really talked a lot. And he joked, well, what are you going to call this thing? We said, well, we're going to call it, I think we had discussed a little bit, we're going to call it "Don't Interrupt Me, Por Favor." And I think it's a fun name. And it gets at this idea of language and, again, living your life in multiple languages and talking to people who do that. So, that's where it came from. And then your second question was, sorry, say it again.
Well, just bringing a podcast, that's another medium.
Yeah. I think more and more people are using other formats to tell stories. And I think, I read amazing things and watch amazing things and that can combine different formats. So you can read something and then you can watch a 2-minute or 5-minute mini documentary. Maybe it's a bit John Oliver-like, maybe it's not. That's powerful. I think you can sort of tweet out a story and hopefully have people find it. I think all the cool kids are on Instagram these days. I think if you want to reach the cool kids, go on Instagram, TikTok. I think it's hard to do a really great job at it. We have someone at the podcast who is our social media editor, and that's what she does to sort of promote the podcast. I think, documentary filmmaking, those skills can make complex stories really more digestible. There's an amazing docuseries called Philly DA that is, I think is just doing an incredible job talking about what Larry Krasner is doing in Philadelphia. I think, playing with the different formats is also fun too. It's also, after doing, for 20 years, like writing something, it's fun to try to figure out, well, what will this look like visually? And what would this sound like? And can we engineer some sound? It's just, there are many ways to tell stories. I guess that's my point.
We had a couple of questions, and I think this has actually come up earlier in the discussion, the idea of awards, journalists working for Pulitzers. And do those kinds of awards, have that affected journalism? Does that affect the kinds of stories that reporters take or how they approach topics?
I mean, I certainly think that there are some editors who want, and there are certainly human beings want to win awards, right? I mean, if you give people awards, whether it's for being the best high kicker in your jujitsu class or whether, you're the best, service journalism story, some people, that works for some people. Absolutely. Does it have broad sweeping implications about journalism? Again, I go back to that BLS, I don't know. That's a great question. That is probably beyond my pay grade. I mean, do I want to win an award? I don't know. Sure. Do I write something to win an award? I don't think so. I don't think so. That's me, but.
Social worker here, but when I'm noticing that a journalist is writing 6, 8, 12 stories on the same topic, and it's elder abuse, I jump on that. I remember Charles Duhigg back in 2007, I believe, did a whole series on elder financial abuse. He called. I was very excited. I wanted to save the message and helped him a little bit with one of those stories. Jessica Silver Greenberg has done excellent reporting on long-term care abuse and binding arbitration agreements, both in nursing homes and out. But those are books that really get to concentrate. And maybe maybe they'll win an award, which is great. But I think it's a tremendous opportunity when they're just focusing on elder abuse. I don't think it's just for an award. But it does seem like they're given the resources and the ability to focus. And I think that when you see that kind of reporting, like, like that's a great time to reach out if what you have to offer fits within what they're reporting on. Because sadly, in a year, they're not going to be reporting on that generally.
Yeah, I agree. I think it makes sense. You see someone who's covering an area you're interested in, then absolutely you can reach out, or you should reach out to them if you have something you want to talk about.
Right.
Okay. Well, we're really coming to the end here. I want to turn things back to Christine, but I just want to end with a couple of comments about having victims tell their stories to the media. And I know, Shawna, you've talked about this already, but because I think it's so important, maybe just if you have another comment or two about it. I know a lot of agency folks understandably are reluctant to ask victims or clients in general to talk to the media. You mentioned issues of kind of that power differential. Is it exploiting clients to talk to the media? What about traumatizing them? What would you say, what advice would you give to people about whether or not it's when they have a situation, because we have so many people asking questions about individuals on this call. What would your advice be about protecting victims and yet not being paternalistic and letting them tell their own stories? Maybe we can end on that.
I mean, look, nonprofits are asking victims to tell their stories for fundraising purposes all the time. You could argue that's exploitative. You're giving, and maybe the elder wants to help that. Some coercion, I hope not. But I see this as kind of similar to that. You're fully trusting that that elder has the right to make a decision about whether they want to speak to media or not. I would say the implications can be really far-reaching. Talking to a reporter, telling your story to a reporter versus telling it to nonprofits. They could use it for fundraising or whatever, also important. But letting elders know that they have that choice, and not pressuring them at all. Again, I like it when the elder tells me first that they're interested. But sometimes reporters call and say, "Hey, I want to talk," and you might have a client where it seems to fit. The client seems like they might be into something like that. You can bring it up. I've never said like, "Oh, this will like change the world. You need to talk." Like, no, it's not like that, because it really is up to the individual. But I think it's an opportunity that that you're offering. Then it's not, you're not empowering anyone. I don't empower people. I link them to people, journalists, or sometimes government officials that could then help them empower themselves, and then, again, helps potentially tens, hundreds of thousands of elders. That's how I look at it. Nick?
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, it's a case, you're doing this on a case-by-case basis. You have responsibility, you have ethics, and I think being paternalistic doesn't always make sense. I think, Lisa, I watched your last webinar you did, and you made a good point early on in the webinar. This is the last one on the CEJC website about, some quote unquote, or not quote unquote, some victims or victims' family members aren't always buying where the community people are necessarily selling to them. They might not want to live through this again. And in that case, it doesn't make sense for them to talk. In other cases, again, on a case-by-case basis, I think it does, particularly if you want public awareness to increase about what's happening in different parts of the country.
And thank you for ending on plugging our last webinar. And thank you both so much for doing this. It really has just really raised the level of this discussion that's so important. And I'm going to turn things over to Christine now to tell you about our upcoming, well, actually, I don't know if we have upcoming webinars, but to close us out. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lisa. I will share my screen again to go over a couple closing slides here. All right, so we just wanted to share contact information. So if there's follow-up questions or information that you'd like to get, we have our panelists have offered their email addresses. And we also have our contact us information for CEJC. We have our link there if you'd like to become a member and support CEJC's work. You can also make a donation. The link is there. And of course, our Twitter. So wanted to share all of that, and we'll make sure that it'll be in the recording, so you'll be able to access this later as well. and a few other closing items. So a recording of the webinar, like I said in the beginning, will be posted on the website as soon as possible. We will also have that handout that Shawna went over. That will be posted on the CEJC website within the week with the recording. Also at the end of the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a very short evaluation survey. And we use that feedback to continue to improve our future CEJC webinars. Additionally, for anyone who requested continuing education units, as I said in the beginning, you'll receive a separate, more in-depth evaluation survey that will need to be completed. You'll receive your continuing education certificate within 14 working days of the event, and CEUs are provided for RNs, LCSWs, MFTs, LEPs, LPCCs, attorneys, and licensed fiduciaries. And if you require proof of your attendance for the training, the general follow-up email sent to all attendees should suffice. So thank you again to our panelists today, as well as the Institute on Aging for co-hosting our event today. We'd also like to thank the following organizations for their support and partnership: the National Center on Elder Abuse, the Legal Aid Association of California, Legal Assistance for Seniors, and Next Avenue. So this concludes our webinar today. Thank you again for attending, and we hope that you join us for future webinars.